There's a photograph taken in Buenos Aires in 1960. A man is standing at a bus stop on Garibaldi Street. He has a briefcase. He is wearing a gray coat. He looks like an accountant. He is not an accountant. His name, the name he is using, is Ricardo Clement. His real name is Adolf Eichmann, and he personally organized the logistics of the deportation and murder of 6 million Jews. For 15 years, he has been hiding in plain sight. Argentina, a job at a Mercedes-Benz factory, a modest house, a wife, children. He goes to work, he comes home, he lives. And then, one evening in May, a car pulls up. He never makes it to the bus. How did they find him? How did a country 9 years old, still fighting for its survival, with no embassies in half the world and no budget to speak of, find the most wanted war criminal alive? The answer is not what you think. It is not technology. It is not money. It is not some genius algorithm or a satellite network. It is something much older than any of that. It is the knowledge that if you do not do this yourself, no one else will. And that knowledge, that specific, bone-deep, historically verified knowledge, is the foundation of everything Israel's intelligence services became, everything they are, and everything they will remain, so long as the world stays exactly as it has always been. Hey, quick pause before we continue. This is a brand new channel, and I'm just getting started. If what you're watching right now is the kind of Jewish history you've been looking for, honest, deep, and told the way it deserves to be told, please subscribe. It literally takes 1 second, it costs you nothing, and it's the single most powerful signal you can send to the YouTube algorithm that this content is worth pushing to more people. More subscribers means more people find this history, and that's the whole point. So hit subscribe, like the video, drop a comment below. I read every single one. And let's get straight back to the story. Stay with me, because this story does not begin in 1948. It does not begin with the Mossad. It does not begin with any building or any budget or any director with a code name. It begins with a people who spent 2,000 years learning, the hard way, what happens when you have no one watching the door. Ask yourself, in the long, brutal 3,000-year history of the Jewish people, how many intelligence services did we have? Think about it. The Egyptians had spies. The Romans had spies. Every medieval European kingdom had informants. The Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, the Tsarist secret police. All of them ran networks, recruited assets, intercepted communications. And the Jews? The Jews had nothing. Not because we weren't capable, not because the tradition didn't understand intelligence. Read the book of Numbers. Moses sent 12 spies into Canaan before the Israelites entered the land. Joshua sent 2 spies into Jericho before the walls came down. The concept of gathering intelligence before you act is older than the Torah is written. It is written into the Torah. But here is what happens to a people with no land, no army, no state, and no sovereignty. You cannot run a foreign intelligence service when you are yourself the foreigner. You cannot build a counterintelligence apparatus when the state apparatus is pointed at you. You cannot recruit assets in the halls of power when the doors to those halls are locked from the inside, and the people who lock them are the threat. For 2,000 years, Jewish survival intelligence was communal, local, and informal. It was the rabbi who knew which judge could be bribed and which couldn't. It was the merchant who heard something in the market and sent a letter to the Kehillah 3 towns over. It was the woman who overheard a conversation in the nobleman's kitchen and told her husband, who told the elders, who quietly helped 60 families pack and leave before the pogrom arrived. That network, informal, fragile, built on trust and terror in equal measure, was all we had. And sometimes it was enough, and sometimes it was not. In 1933, it was not enough. When Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, there was no Jewish intelligence service analyzing his intentions. There was no Jewish diplomatic corps reading the dispatches. There was no Jewish military command wargaming the scenarios. There were Jewish newspapers arguing about whether it would really be that bad. There were Jewish community leaders writing letters to their German neighbors asking for calm. There were Jewish families, highly educated, deeply assimilated, decorated veterans of the First World War, telling their children, "We are Germans. We will be fine." They were not fine. 6 million of them were not fine. And the lesson that burned into the founding generation of the State of Israel, the ones who survived, the ones who built, the ones who swore never again with the specific operational meaning of that phrase. The lesson was this: you cannot outsource your survival. You cannot trust other nations to protect you, because other nations will not. You cannot rely on international institutions, because international institutions will watch and take minutes and pass resolutions while your people burn. You cannot wait for the world to come to its senses, because the world has demonstrated, repeatedly and at scale, that its senses are not oriented in your direction. You must know, before they move, before they plan, before they arm, you must know. And you must act on what you know, because there is no one else who will. That is not paranoia. That is not aggression. That is history. And history, unlike ideology, does not care whether you believe it. Now, here is the part they don't tell you in the documentaries. Because everybody knows that Israel built great intelligence services after 1948. Everybody nods along at the Mossad, at Shin Bet, at Unit 8200. What nobody asks is, where did the people who built those services come from? What were they doing before the state existed? The answer changes everything. Before Israel was a state, there was the Haganah, and inside the Haganah, there was a unit called the Shai, the Sherut Yediot, the Information Service. Founded in 1940, operating in secret, completely illegal under British mandatory law. Illegal under British law in what was supposed to become a Jewish homeland. If that sentence doesn't capture the entire 20th century Jewish condition in 12 words, I don't know what does. The Shai was extraordinary, not because of its resources, it had almost none, but because of its methods. It ran informants inside the British administration. It intercepted communications. It tracked Arab military movements. It maintained card indexes, physical card indexes filled out by hand on thousands of individuals across Mandatory Palestine. It recruited Jewish women to work as secretaries and translators in British government offices, and those women fed intelligence back to the Haganah with the kind of calm, invisible efficiency that only becomes possible when the work feels existential. Because for them, it was. These were not professional spies trained at some academy. They were teachers, doctors, farmers, shopkeepers, people who had chosen to build a life in a land that was still being fought over. People who understood that the difference between the Jewish community surviving and not surviving might come down to whether someone remembered to update a card index this week. That discipline, amateur in origin, professional in application, driven entirely by the understanding that the stakes were absolute, that discipline became the genetic code of everything that followed. End of Act 1. But before we move, you think you know where this story goes. You think you know what motivated these people. You think it was anger, trauma, vengeance. You're wrong. Or rather, you're only 1/3 right, and the other 2/3 are more interesting and more important, and will change how you understand everything Israel has done in the decades since. Here is a fact that tends to stop a room. In 1948, the year Israel declared independence, the total Jewish population of the new state was approximately 600,000 people. 600,000. The combined Arab armies that immediately invaded Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, with Saudi Arabian and Yemeni contingents, represented a coalition of states with a combined population of approximately 40 million. Write that ratio down: 600,000 against 40 million. Now ask yourself, what does a country do when it cannot afford to be wrong? When a single catastrophic intelligence failure does not mean a government falls or a party loses an election, but means the country ceases to exist and the people in it are killed. You do not build intelligence to win. You build intelligence because without it, you are already dead. This is the piece that gets lost when Western observers analyze Israeli intelligence. They frame it as aggression. They frame it as paranoia, as overreach, as a country that cannot help but project force. And sometimes, those criticisms have merit. Israeli intelligence has made mistakes, catastrophic ones. We will get to that. But the baseline, the foundational architecture, is not aggression. It is arithmetic. Small population, hostile neighborhood, no strategic depth, no room to retreat, regroup, and try again. One major failure, and there is no second act. When you have no margin for error, you think about error differently. Let me give you a specific example. In the early 1950s, Israeli intelligence was tracking Egyptian military developments with genuine alarm. Egypt was rearming. The question, the critical, survival-level question, was whether Egypt intended to attack, and if so, when. A Western intelligence agency in that situation has options. It can wait for more information. It can run the analysis and present 3 possible scenarios to the policymakers. It can hedge. It can be wrong, absorb the consequence, and rebuild. A Western intelligence agency failing on a major estimate is a scandal. It is a congressional hearing. It is careers ended and reforms introduced. An Israeli intelligence agency failing on a major estimate is a war on 3 fronts with a country of 600,000 people. That asymmetry produces a completely different intelligence culture. It produces an insistence on human intelligence, on actual people inside the target, not just signals and analysis. Because a human source can tell you intent, and satellites can only tell you capability. It produces a culture of improvisation, because when you cannot afford the best equipment, you get very good at working with what you have. It produces a culture of extreme compartmentalization, because when your entire intelligence apparatus is small enough to fit in a single building, one penetration can destroy everything. And it produces something else, something that is harder to name and easier to feel. It produces a culture where the people doing the work know personally why the work matters. This is the thing. This is the thing that no training program, no budget increase, no reorganization memo can manufacture. You cannot buy it. You cannot train it into someone who doesn't feel it in their chest. The men and women who built Israeli intelligence in the 1940s and 50s, and the ones who carried it forward in the 60s and 70s and beyond, were not doing a job. They were not career civil servants who had tested well on an aptitude exam and selected intelligence work over banking. They were people for whom the alternative to success was not a poor performance review. The alternative to success was what happened in Europe. They knew the people who had died. They were the people who had survived. And the distance between those 2 categories was the width of a visa stamp, a border crossing, a boat that left port before the port was sealed. That is not a metaphor. That is biography. That is the specific, traceable, personal history of the people who recruited the first assets, ran the first operations, built the first networks. They were not abstract patriots defending an abstract nation. They were people with names and memories and photographs in their pockets. And they understood with absolute clarity what the world looked like when Jewish people had no one watching the door. Now, I told you there was a fact in this act that contradicts the official version. Here it is. The story that gets told about Israeli intelligence, in the movies, in the bestsellers, in the breathless profiles, is the story of success. Entebbe, the capture of Eichmann, the targeted killings, the penetrations, the technology, the unit, the legend. What that story obscures is the Yom Kippur War. October 1973. Egypt and Syria launch a coordinated, massive surprise attack on Israel, on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish year, the day when religious Jews fast and secular Jews tend not to turn on their televisions. Israel's intelligence community, the same community celebrated for finding Eichmann, for running assets across the Arab world, for being, by the early 70s, genuinely one of the best in the business, completely failed to see it coming. Not slightly wrong, not a minor miscalculation, a catastrophic, total, foundational failure. Egypt and Syria had been signaling their intentions for months. There were human sources inside the Egyptian military command. There was signals intelligence. There was satellite imagery. There was a Mossad asset, a senior Egyptian official, one of the most valuable human sources any Western intelligence service had ever run, who delivered a warning directly, explicitly, unambiguously, and Israeli intelligence dismissed it. Why? Because of a concept called the conception, ha-conceptia. The Israeli intelligence community had developed a model, a framework, a set of assumptions about what Egypt would and would not do. And that model said Egypt would not attack without achieving air superiority first. Egypt did not have air superiority. Therefore, Egypt would not attack. The warning came in. The warning did not fit the model. The model won. 2,600 Israeli soldiers died in the first days of that war. And here is the thing. Here is what makes this not just a military history fact, but a story about intelligence and identity, and what it means to build a service on the foundation of existential necessity. The Yom Kippur failure broke something. And then, because the stakes were still absolute and the alternative was still unthinkable, the breaking produced something. Not an excuse, not a cover-up, not a reorganization memo that reshuffled the org chart and called it reform. It produced a culture that learned to institutionalize doubt, to build skepticism into the architecture, to require devil's advocates, to mandate that someone, somewhere in the system, is always paid to argue that the consensus is wrong. Because the conception killed 2,600 people, and the lesson was never again. With the specific operational meaning of that phrase, would an intelligence failure be permitted to masquerade as analysis? That is not a comfortable story. It is not the story of an infallible secret service. It is the story of an institution that failed, looked directly at the failure, and rebuilt around what the failure revealed. And the fact that Israeli intelligence had the capacity to do that, to absorb catastrophe and become harder, not softer, more rigorous, not more cautious. That capacity also comes from the same foundation. When you have no margin, you cannot afford to protect your assumptions. You must be willing to be wrong out loud, institutionally, on the record, so that you are less wrong tomorrow. Remember the man at the bus stop, Ricardo Clement, Garibaldi Street, Buenos Aires. Let me tell you what it actually took to get there. The operation that found Adolf Eichmann did not begin with a satellite. It did not begin with a signals intercept. It began with a teenage girl in Argentina. Sylvia Hermann, the daughter of a Holocaust survivor living in Buenos Aires. She began dating a young man named Klaus Eichmann. Klaus, proud of his father, let slip to a Jewish girl without apparently registering the significance that his father had been a high-ranking Nazi officer and was living nearby under a false name. Sylvia told her father. Her father, Lothar Hermann, was blind. He had survived the camps. He wrote a letter, a physical letter, to the Israeli consulate in Argentina and to Fritz Bauer, the German Jewish prosecutor who was quietly hunting war criminals from inside the West German justice system. Bauer passed the information to the Mossad. The Mossad sent a team. The team spent months in Buenos Aires confirming the identity, watching the house on Garibaldi Street, tracking the man in the gray coat. They needed to be certain. They needed to be absolutely, irrevocably certain, because what they were about to do was illegal under international law, a sovereign violation of Argentinian territory, an act that would cause a diplomatic incident. They were certain. They did it anyway. Eichmann was brought to Israel, tried in public, convicted, and executed in 1962. The only execution Israel has ever carried out. Now, why does that story matter in the context of what Israeli intelligence became? Because the Eichmann operation was not really an intelligence operation in the classic sense. Classic intelligence is about gathering information, about knowing what your adversary knows and what your adversary doesn't know you know. The Eichmann operation was about something else. It was about accountability. It was about the proposition that Jewish lives are not expendable, that the murder of Jewish people is not an event that simply passes into history without consequence. And that proposition, that specific, operationally meaningful proposition, became the philosophical backbone of everything Israeli intelligence does. Other nations' intelligence services are organized around national interest, around geopolitical objectives, around the cold calculations of what serves the state at a given moment. Israeli intelligence is organized around those things too, but underneath them, foundational, non-negotiable, is something that has no equivalent in the CIA or MI6 or the DGSE. It is the understanding that the Jewish state exists specifically because Jewish people have no one else. That the State of Israel is not simply a country with an intelligence service. It is an answer to a question. The question is, what do you do when the world will not protect you? And the answer is, you build something that will. That answer has costs. It has moral costs, operational costs, costs that serious people can and should debate. Israeli intelligence has done things that are wrong. It has killed people who should not have been killed. It has run operations that violated the sovereignty of allied nations. It has made decisions under pressure that did not survive scrutiny in the daylight. The record is not clean. But the record is also this: Operation Wrath of God. After 11 Israeli athletes were murdered at the Munich Olympics in 1972, Israel did not file a complaint. It did not convene an inquiry. It did not wait for West Germany to process its own failures, or for the international community to act, or for time to pass and wounds to heal. It identified the planners and the operators of the massacre, and over the following years, it found them, one by one. Not because it was legal, not because it was clean, because the alternative of allowing the murder of Jews at the Olympic Games to pass without consequence, was not an alternative that Israeli intelligence could accept, would not accept. There is a line in the Talmud: whoever destroys a single soul, Scripture accounts it as if he had destroyed an entire world. The inverse, whoever saves a single soul, is usually the part that gets quoted at bat mitzvahs. But the original framing is a statement about the weight of a life. Any life. Every life. Israeli intelligence operates at its best from that weight. Not abstractly, concretely, with names, with photographs. with the understanding that the people they are protecting are not statistics. They are people, with families, with Shabbat dinners, with opinions about whether the hummus at that place is actually better than the other place. And with the understanding that the people who would destroy them have, historically, not been shy about their intentions. The world's most successful intelligence service did not become successful because it had the best technology, although it has developed extraordinary technology. It did not become successful because it had the biggest budget, although its budget is significant. It became successful because the people running it, the officers, the analysts, the case officers meeting assets in hotel rooms in cities across the world, those people understand personally, historically, in their bones, what the failure of intelligence looks like. It looks like 6 million. It looks like Munich. It looks like a bus in Buenos Aires that a man in a gray coat never made it to. And that understanding, that specific, non-abstract, historically grounded understanding of what failure costs, is something you cannot teach in a classroom. You can only inherit it. Here is what I want to say directly to you. If you are Jewish and you are watching this, American, British, Australian, Israeli diaspora, wherever you are sitting right now, I want you to sit with something for a moment. We grew up in countries that have intelligence services, the CI, MI6, ASIO. We pay taxes that fund those services. We elect governments that oversee them. And those services are, in their way, competent. They do important work. They prevent things we never hear about, because prevention, by definition, leaves no news story. But those services do not exist for us, not specifically, not in the way that matters. When the CIA is deciding how to allocate resources, the safety of the Jewish community is one consideration among many. When British intelligence is setting priorities, the security of diaspora Jews is part of a larger picture. That is not a conspiracy. That is how states work. States protect their interests. We are one interest among many. Israel is the only state in the world where the intelligence community exists specifically, architecturally, foundationally, in its DNA, because Jewish survival is the mission, not a mission, the mission. And I think, if we are honest with ourselves, we feel the weight of that. We feel it when we watch the news. We feel it at the Seder when someone reads the part about every generation rising up against us, and someone else laughs nervously because the laugh is easier than sitting with the truth. We feel it when we walk past a synagogue with a security guard outside, and we remember a time when there wasn't one. The question this story asks, the question the history asks, is not whether Israel's intelligence services are perfect. They are not. The question is whether the world has changed enough that the motivation that built those services no longer applies. It has not. The threats are different. The technology is different. The geography of danger has shifted. But the fundamental reality, that Jewish safety is not guaranteed by the goodwill of nations that have other priorities, that reality has not changed. It has not changed since before there was a Mossad. It has not changed since before there was a State of Israel. It has not changed since Garibaldi Street in Buenos Aires in 1960. And so the intelligence services of Israel remain what they have always been. Not the most feared because they are the most brutal. Not the most effective because they are the most funded. The most effective because the people running them understand, at a level that cannot be manufactured and cannot be faked, that the cost of failure is not a congressional hearing. The cost of failure is everything. That is what history tries to tell us, and for once, just this once, we should probably listen to it before it tells us again. A nation that does not protect itself will not be protected. David Ben-Gurion, first Prime Minister of Israel.